who will be known to most of you by reputation, if nothing else, Dr. Richard North. We probably got to know him best originally with his cooperation with Christopher Booker. I particularly remember a book of theirs called The Mad Officials, and as I was in the toils of officialdom at the time, I recognised the deep truths in that. They together produced probably the definitive work on the European Union called The Great Deception, the history of the EU, and he's also a military historian, recently published The Ministry of Defeat on our disastrous expedition to Iraq, and the many, not the few, which could be called A People's History of the Battle of Britain. And now he's going to talk to us on the way forward. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, Andrew. Just on a personal note, it must be about 2 years or perhaps more since I've stood in front of a public meeting. It's a minor miracle that I'm here at all. It was about 2 years ago that I was diagnosed with a life-threatening disease, a heart valve defect, and about 18 months ago I had to have open heart surgery when they added a piece of pig to my heart from a slaughterhouse operator who I knew well and was absolutely delighted to see his bits being used to such a great effect. So now we have before you North with added pig, who has a 20-year warranty and intends to make the most of it. So, with that, without further ado, I'm slightly out of practice, but nonetheless I shall make up for lost time. Now, rightly and properly, Professor Middleton takes us through history and rehearses the ideas as to why we all want to leave the European Union. Now, this is very much a given and is my launch platform because evidently you would not be here as a campaign for independent Britain if you did not already want to leave. Where I believe the movement as a whole has been derelict almost to the point of criminal negligence is in not properly rehearsing, and in sometimes not at all rehearsing, the way forward, not so much as to why we want to leave, but how we leave. And this is absolutely crucial and becomes more and more crucial as eventually we lurch towards a point of possibly the greatest danger we can imagine, and that's an in-out referendum that we're not ready for and are planning to lose, to the extent that it will set us back, the whole Eurosceptic movement, a generation or more, as of course happened in '75. And frankly, we agree, Professor Middleton, that if we took on board a in-out referendum now, or even in the foreseeable future, the prognostication is that we must almost certainly lose it. So without some very, very serious thought, and some strategic thought, we are not in a position to even consider it. What we are and need to be doing is giving our movement that strategic thought, that strategic planning. Now, after Thursday's advance, we might think, or some, and certainly some of the less informed, which means all of them, media, and I do wonder at this term, the mainstream media. The media actually represents minority opinion. It is not the mainstream, it is the minority. I always call it the legacy media because it isn't mainstream, nor indeed are the politicians. But certainly a view is taken that Thursday, or the results of Thursday, took us at a great leap forward. And I raise in my opening remarks a few words of caution. The headline figure of 25% is, of course, a miasma. It's not true. What you need to look at is a political situation where the population is retreating from politics. So that what actually counts is not the headline share of the vote, but the turnout. And when we looked at the turnout, it varies from about 27% to about 30-point-something%. So a headline figure of 24% actually is only about 8-9%, in fact less. And in fact, UKIP's span of what I call mandate, the share of the electorate, ranged between 6.5% and 8%. So all this 20 years of effort has managed to do is infuse a tiny fraction, not even 10% of the population, and drag them out to vote in a context where the year-on-year or election-on-election turnout is decreasing. So we have political parties fishing in a shrinking pool, and all they're doing is they're redistributing a shrinking vote between them. That does not seem to me the hallmark of a successful political movement, or one that is actually going anywhere. And it's that very much conditions my thinking and what I'm about to say to you. I did rather inelegantly suggest that in fact political fighting these days is simply bald men fighting over a comb, only you have to add the women now these days. Hey, so, the point, and again Professor Middleton gives me unwittingly a wonderful platform, the idea that the EU was a slow-motion coup d'etat. Can be stated in slightly different terms, but equally accurate. It was a revolution. It was a revolution in the way that we were governed. That makes us, if you like, in rejecting the European Union, either counter-revolutionaries or revolutionaries in our own right. And I certainly feel that we are looking for a revolution in the way we are governed, but it does, by definition, make us revolutionaries, and if we are revolutionaries, then it's about time we thought in revolutionary terms and behaved like revolutionaries. Now, it doesn't mean to say we have to have bandanas and Che Guevara t-shirts, but it does mean a way of thinking and a way of strategizing. We have to recognize that that is what we are after, a revolution in the way we are governed. And it is fair to say, and of course it is going to be fair to say, because I'm going to say it, that no revolution succeeds without a plan. A strategic plan. We have to think strategically, and without a strategic plan, we are not going to succeed. And for 20 or more years, and I've been at this anti-Euro stuff for what, since 72-ish, way before we joined actually, I have not seen within the Eurosceptic movement anything which approaches a coherent, structured, or sensible plan as to how we're going to leave. And I think, you know, with about 20 years of a formal party against the EU, it is about time we actually gave a little consideration to it. And here, for the rest of my speech, is going to be my offer as to the broader structure of what I believe a plan should contain. And in the limited time available to me, all I can do is give you some markers, and to that extent I have for you 6 points. Here we go. Point 1. The first thing we need is a credible, and I do stress in capitals 10 miles high, a credible exit plan. In other words, it's not good enough to say, oh yes, we must leave. As I've said in my introductory remarks, we must have a coherent, credible idea of how we leave. It's not necessarily going to be the most desirable means of leaving, because a lot of people would prefer to leave tomorrow, which would be frankly suicide if we put it into action. It must be credible, and it must be one which can attract support. So I'll come on to that and I'll discuss that in some detail. The second is that we must deal, because the EU has been positioned wrongly as an economic association or structure, we must deal with business, and we must deal with concerns of business, and we must be able to reassure business that its interests will be looked after when we do leave. Not if, when. Thirdly, and some of this comes from my study of particularly the Second World War period, when strangely, well not strangely, those of you who have studied it will know that the war was not popular, that British society was deeply divided, that the left in particular was very anti-war, and with some justice rejected the blandishments of the political leaders in saying, yes, we've heard all this rhetoric before, we heard it during the First World War with homes fit to heroes, and ended up being shafted at the end of it. So that if you want us to make the sacrifices to fight this war, we must have something out of it. What's in it for us? And he was putting it in a very interesting debate in October 1940, in the middle of the Blitz. MPs were discussing what were termed war aims, and the view was expressed that you cannot, and here we were talking about fighting the Second World War, you cannot win a campaign on a negative. In other words, winning then was regarded not enough. You have to have a positive vision. You must be able to provide something positive for people to aim at that affects them, to motivate them. Now the same applies to leaving the European Union. It is not enough to fight a negative campaign. We must leave. We have to provide an alternative vision, the vision thing, for people to aspire to. And if we judge it properly, necessarily at the end of that, leaving the EU just becomes an inevitable and necessary consequence of achieving our vision. So that actually becomes an essential point 3. Point 4 is that sort of vision and ideas, and the general ideas we have as how to leave, doesn't spread itself spontaneously or accidentally. So that we have to develop a coherent network which is actually specifically set up and able to spread the word in a proper, coordinated fashion. And it's no accident that one of the first things the Europhiles did was set up the European movement, which had precisely that effect. So we'll look at that. Number 5, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because it's way downstream, is basically no government ever does anything willingly, and certainly doesn't change its policy willingly. And when push comes to shove, there will be a time when we have to stop saying please and start telling them they will, and using all the legal means of actually pressurising government in a prolonged and spirited campaign of agitation, of which there are plenty of historical precedents. And we're going to have to think about that. Finally, I always enjoy General Patton, who told his soldiers that we are here to defend democracy, not to practice it. Is that we need to develop our own shock troops, but we also need to respect the different organisations with the different heritages which are in this game. There is not going to be a single supremo, ego, or dictator that is going to tell us how to run our affairs. We need to develop a coalition spirit so that we enable different organisations to work together towards a common objective, rather than trying for these ghastly umbrella groups and single operations and single heads that are going to instruct us. So number 6 is we need a working coalition. Right, let's look individually and quickly at each of these. First of all, in terms of credible exit plan, item 1. Now, we've spent an awful lot of time on this, and I have to say there's an awful lot of stupidity talked about this. And the fact is that the idea of a sudden death exit is not a credible plan. There are far too many economic interests involved, but far too many complicated legalities. And in terms of 40 years of integration, we cannot turn the clock backwards overnight. It has to be a phased withdrawal. It's going to be difficult and complicated, not least because very few people these days actually understand how we're governed, or for the fact of the matter that most of our legislation actually no longer comes from Brussels. because we've acquired, without even realising it, a top level of government which is based in Bern, in Geneva, in Basel, and points west and east, where very often the European Union is simply implementing laws which are actually made elsewhere. And a big place of lawmaking is in fact Geneva. Now, how we unravel these is going to be extremely difficult, and it certainly isn't going to happen overnight. Now, fortunately, and I haven't got time to go into the detail, but fortunately, Lisbon Treaty did give us Article 50. It is a genuine exit article. It was actually introduced by Spinelli, and I interviewed the people who were actually Spinelli's political advisors. Richard Balfe was one of them. And it was sincerely meant. It was implemented in the Lisbon Treaty, and it does give us the opportunity of a structured negotiation, and from that it is possible to demand negotiations. And the option, it seems to me, that we can look at is rejoining EFTA and going through the EEA route, at which point, and I'll come back to this in phase 2, in item 2, is we do not look for immediate abolition of law, of European law. This is not an option. Quite frankly, we do not. I mean, if you think just in one small terms, it was raised by Owen Paterson recently. If, say, we abolished all European law, that means overnight we'd have no environmental law. It would mean the fly tipping would no longer be an offence. It would mean the water purity would no longer have a legal base. So in fact, what we've got to do is look at the law and then gradually work it out and work our own law, replace our own law, and that is not going to happen easily or quickly. So what we do is we repatriate, and that's the thing, repatriate European law, so it becomes our law. Once it's our law, we can then change it. But immediately what we do is we adopt everything and then sit back and look intelligently at it and then work out how we're going to deal with it. And then what I'm suggesting is that whatever negotiations we do have with the EU, which results in a termination agreement, we then put a sunset clause on it, so that 10 years we can come back and relook at it, and whatever mistakes we might have made, we can revisit and perhaps improve. Now, I could easily spend a whole day discussing this, but that has to be the limit of what I can explore, other than to say that if, as a movement, we ourselves cannot agree an exit plan between ourselves, how then can we expect the general population to take the lead from us and agree with us when we can't agree ourselves? So it becomes absolutely essential, in my view, that we have to focus our minds on an agreed, coherent plan. Okay, that's point 1. Point 2, taking the cue again from Professor Middleton. The EU is political, always was political. It has been disguised as an economic entity and using economics as a means of achieving political integration. That said, it is political, which means that business has no locus in any campaign. Business will look after itself. Business is not our friend. Business has its own superficial and selfish objectives, and it has no locus in telling us, the people, how we should be governed. It is our job, the people, to tell business what framework we are prepared to allow it in which it can operate. It has a right to stability and predictability, but it has no right to tell us how or what form of government should be applied to us. So these business campaigns are actually false in the sense that they have no right to be involved in the game. This is about how we are governed. That is a decision for people, the people, not business. So therefore, item 2 is to reassure, it's first of all put business back in its box and say this is none of your business. It is our business, not yours. But secondly, then to say that an exit plan and any subsequent agreements will respect business need for continuity and for the stability and predictability that it needs to operate. And we need to develop that. And of course that links with the exit plan, is that if we develop an exit plan that business can live with, then business is then marginalised. We say it's nothing to do with you, we've looked after your interests, go away. And we will argue about our constitution and our constitutional affairs. And that, in the short term, will require protecting, loathsome though it may be, the single market. But in fact, much of the single market legislation, as I say, doesn't actually come from Brussels instead. You'd be surprised to find out where it did come from. Okay, number 3. Now, I hear with growing despair the ideas expressed for, say, how we are subject, and I'm sorry, this is not going to be popular, but how we are subject to the tyranny of Brussels and the unelected commissioners and all the rest. Excuse me, ladies and gentlemen. How many people in this room elected our Prime Minister? Eh? Hands up. Who elected our Prime Minister here? We have an unelected Prime Minister. Who elected our Cabinet? We have an unelected Cabinet. Now, who... Sorry, go on.
Whereas in the European organisation, commissioners are selected by conversations between heads of state.
No.
In Britain, you are not in the cabinet, you are not the Prime Minister until you have submitted yourself for election to Parliament. Now that doesn't happen in Europe.
All right, and I'll take this on board later in questions, but let me just say, post-Lisbon, elected heads of state and government, actually heads of government, elected heads of government, democratically, say the European Union, decide upon the most suitable candidate for the President of the Commission, who is then ratified by the elected European Parliament in a democratic decision to decide who is the best person for the job. Now, this is rhetoric, I know, but it's rhetoric they use. But it actually has some credibility, some limited credibility, in the same way that we elect MPs who then elect to become an electoral college with various other peripheral procedures, elect or appoint a Prime Minister. But the fact is, we do not ourselves, under general sufferance, universal sufferance, elect a Prime Minister. We do not. Now, putting it at local level, what is the essence of democracy? It's 2 words, demos, the demos of the people, which is actually considered or defined further as a community of interest. A single group of people with a common idea, a common feeling of how they should be governed. Now, there are several demos and structured demos. There's the national demos, but there's the local demos. Now, I got on the train today to come from Bradford. 200 miles away, it might as well be 10,000 miles away in democracy terms. I have a local government, they tell me. We have a population of 500,000 people. When we have police commissioners, we can have a local police force governing us with a local police commissioner for West Yorkshire. The population of West Yorkshire is 2.2 million. In the list of United Nations countries, there are 100 countries in the United Nations smaller than West Yorkshire. If we go to Iceland, which has a population of 312,000, it has 56 municipalities, local government bodies. In other words, what I'm coming to in a very laborious way, and we can have great entertainment talking about this, is that the EU is not the fount of all evil. There is a great deal wrong with the existing system, and in many ways it deteriorates. And much of what is in the EU is there by sufferance or under the control of British politicians. So that in many senses, leaving the EU solves very little, and in fact does not address many of the problems that we deal with day to day, and many of the complications in the way our society is run and governed, that have absolutely nothing to do with Brussels. And after all, perhaps you picked up this obscenity with this secret court of protection, which jailed a woman in secret without allowing the fact that she was in jail to be published. That wasn't Brussels. That was a British court with British judges under British law. Hence, 3, an alternative system. Simply withdrawing from the EU to hand back power or give more power, the power will be recovered, to the same ghastly crew in Westminster and Whitehall that have made such a ghastly mess of things already is simply not an attractive option. If we repatriate powers, we must look to have a new settlement between the people and those who govern us. And it is that vision, perhaps based on issues of self-governance, perhaps based on issues of smaller local authorities, perhaps based on issues of direct democracy, but let's put it in the melting pot and say, let's design a new Britain so that when we actually, and when I say we leave the EU, we are not just leaving something and not a negative, but we are moving towards something which is worth having. And that's something, incidentally, things like direct democracy. Article 10 of the treaty says that the founding principle of the European Union is representative democracy. Well, when you analyse representative democracy, it's a contradicting terms. Direct democracy is actual real democracy, but it's incompatible with our membership of the European Union, which is, of course, why they hate referendums. So we cannot have a new Britain and remain in the European Union, and therefore the very fact that we go for an alternative Britain means that we necessarily end up having to leave the European Union, and that is perhaps the most sound basis for an exit campaign. It just becomes an inevitable consequence of something we actually want, rather than the objective in itself. Strategy. We have actually, and there's a couple of people in this room who know what I'm talking about when I refer to Harrogate Agenda, because we based a new vision of Britain on a 6-point plan, another 6-point plan, based on the Chartists, and we'll be rolling this out through the year. So keep your eyes out for Harrogate Agenda, and there may be some ideas that you like. That brings us to 4, and Edward hasn't screened it yet, so I must do it again. Now, this again is not going to be popular. It's certainly not going to be popular with what we laughingly call the progressives. But what we have to say is, if I go back to square one and say we are basically revolutionaries, you also have to say, from a study of history and a study of rational common sense, that no revolution ever succeeded without an intellectual base, and that's the unfashionable business, talking about intellect and intellectual arguments and intellectual base. But whether you talk about the ersatz intellectual base of communism or socialism, at least they had the pretense of an intellectual base. But the more fundamentally sound your intellectual base is, the better off you are of convincing more and more people. But the problem, as I said right at the beginning, is that spreading ideas does not happen spontaneously or by accident. You actually have to design a program of spreading your ideas. And actually, you can go back to British history of the 18th, 19th century, particularly the 19th century especially, with the building of mechanics institutes, of Ruskin College, of university colleges, where the ideas of socialism, wrong-headed though they may be, were actually physically taught and promoted. They weren't spread accidentally. And we have to do the same if we have good ideas. We cannot rely on them simply happening. But we have to set ourselves up with schools, with foundations, with lectures, with colleges. That's what the European Union did. If we're going to match it, we've got to do the same. That's going to be hard, but we have to do it. It's not as hard as you might think. I said I wasn't going to talk much about 5, but in fact, it has been said of the British, and we hear this ghastly word, it's not a good word, the sheeple. But there's certainly a tendency among the British to be overly compliant, overly obedient, and somewhat complacent, and too easy to obey, and too slow to complain. Now, we also are told of the theory of governance, that governance requires the consent of the people. Now, in the final analysis, that horrible cliche, things don't start changing until we withdraw consent. Now, the trouble is, if we withdraw consent, it doesn't have much effect until we actually let government know that we have withdrawn our consent, which augurs for a long-term and difficult campaign of, if you like, civil disobedience, for want of a phrase. But in our civilization, if you call it that, in our society, the whole of our conditioning is towards compliance and obedience. We are taught obedience at school, our parents teach us obedience, and therefore the trouble is that disobedience has to be learned. And we have to relearn how to be disobedient, how to fight our government legally, safely, without violence, but we need to relearn the principles of disobedience and how to actually fight for our rights. And that's item 5. Item 6, I don't need to detain us much, except to say that I've seen too many years where one or other semi-demagogue or egotistic person comes up and says, "Follow me," or starts laying down the law, or starts calling for umbrella groups, or whatever. Whereas the reality is that long-standing campaigns like the CIB, which has a proud history, good people, good capabilities, but not enough strength to fight alone, needs to learn to work as a part of a coalition with other groups, and we need to build coalitions, build networks, so that when we see something good, we can spread it, we can work together, we can coordinate action. But not let other people run us, but simply work together better. Because that's what the Europhiles do, and that's what they do so successfully. And we have to learn the same tactics, so that we need to be looking at coalition building, not umbrella networks, but coalitions, where we are able to project the same ideas, adopt the same ideas, agree the same ideas, and minimize our infighting and maximize our inherent strengths, wisdoms, cleverness, and experience. Now, given that, and I've only had 20 minutes or slightly more actually, but to rehash, we start with a plan, a coming plan or not, but a plan that we must have, and without a plan we are not going to succeed. How we do that is going to be interesting, but that is where we shoot ahead to number 6, our coalition, is we really do, ladies and gentlemen, need to make this happen. Now, at the beginning, I said I had a 20-year warranty for my new bit. So there's your time limit. I have spent far too many years watching the Eurosceptic movement fail. It seems to exult in failure. One sometimes wonders whether it particularly designs failure. And I'm a bit fed up of failing. I actually want to win. So 6 points for plan. Disagree? By all means. Who am I to say otherwise? All I will say is we must have a plan, we must do something about getting a plan, and when we do, we will win, and we jolly well deserve to. Thank you, Edward. Thank you, ladies.